Our next presentation is item 8, recommended minimum flows for Horse Creek and Charlie Creek, and that'll be presented by Dr. Yonas Ghile from Southwest Florida Water Management District. Yonas, before I cut to you. Purpose is to inform the committee on the draft reports prepared by the Southwest Florida Water Management District on the minimum flows for Horse Creek and Charlie Creek. This relates to the hydrologic restoration priority action 2, to participate in development, re-evaluation and implementation of scientifically sound freshwater minimum flows and levels for surface water and groundwater resources. And Yonas, are you online?
Yeah, yes. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. I cannot do video presentation. My camera in my laptop is not working. I'm sorry. So good morning, everyone. My name is Yonas Ghile. I'm lead hydrogeologist with the district. And let me quickly introduce the technical team who have been working on these 2 projects. Christina Dick, a senior environmental scientist and a co-lead for these 2 projects. She's not here today. She's in a vacation. And Gabe Herrick, lead environmental scientist. Gabe is our in-stream fish habitat expert. And Doug Lipper, our minimum flows and levels program lead. Doug oversees the district's minimum flows and levels work. Next slide. Yeah, so as you may know, the district is required to develop a minimum flow by Florida statute. Minimum flow being the limit at which further withdrawals would be significantly harmful to the water resource or ecology of the area. So I just want to point out that minimum flow is not designed to mitigate any water quality impairment or pollution. Specifically, it's designed to prevent significant harm due to withdrawals. And the map in the right shows the minimum flows and levels developed by the district so far. There are over 200, including lake levels, wetland levels, minimum flows for freshwater systems, springs and estuaries, and minimum aquifer levels as well. And again, minimum flow is not a permit by itself, but once it's developed and adopted in the rule, it's used in district water use permitting and water supply planning programs. Next slide. And the Florida statute identifies the following 10 environmental values that the district must consider when developing minimum flows or levels. And this includes a variety of ecological values and human uses, such as navigation, freshwater storage, and supply. And the district approach for flowing systems is a percent flow reduction method, in which we evaluate the percentages that can potentially be reduced from the flow without causing any significant harm to the values listed here. However, significant harm is not defined by Florida statute. So the district uses 15% change or a reduction in habitat to identify significant harm. And this approach has been supported by many peer review panels who were convened to review minimum flows report. And there is also a support from the scientific literature as well. Next slide. Okay, next is to look at the overview of the Horse Creek and Charlie Creek watersheds. Both systems, they are major tributaries flowing into Peace River. The Horse Creek drains the western portion of the Peace River, and it's about 54 miles long. And the mean annual flow is 185 cubic feet per second based on the historical flow record from 1950 through 2021. And majority of the land is agriculture, and there's also mining in the upper part of the Horse Creek watershed, about 12%. And the Charlie Creek drains the eastern part of the Peace River watershed, and it's 42 miles long. And the mean annual flow is 262 cubic feet per second. And majority of the land is agriculture, including pasture, citrus crops, and vegetables. Next slide. Okay, now let's have a look some of our technical works we conducted to develop minimum flows for Horse Creek and Charlie Creek. The first step was the baseline flow development. A baseline flow is defined the flow that would exist without any withdrawal impact. And the baseline flow serves us as a reference when we evaluate or when we calculate the percentages that can be reduced without causing any significant harm to resource. And to do this, the district invested on a model called PRIM, Peace River Integrated Model, which integrates both surface and groundwater together. And with this model, we were able to quantify the impact of both surface and groundwater withdrawals on flowing systems, lakes, wetlands, and aquifer levels. So what you see here are the hydrographs using the gauged flow and baseline flow. Baseline flow meaning gauged flow, but adjusted for withdrawal impacts. So clearly, as you can see here, the gauged flow is slightly higher than the corresponding baseline flow. And this is attributed to the excess runoff gained by the systems from groundwater used for irrigation. And once the baseline flow is developed, then the next step is to divide the flow regime into blocks to represent low, medium, and high flow regimes. So in our case, we divided the blocks into 4. Block 1, block 2, and block 3 is divided into 2. And actually, there is a suggestion now from the peer review even to divide block 3 into 3 sub-blocks. So in the next slide, in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about how minimum flows have been developed for each blocks. Okay, the first one is the block 1 minimum flow, or the low flow threshold. This is a limit where withdrawal is not allowed throughout the year unless the low flow threshold is exceeded. And 2 criteria were considered: the flow requirement for fish passage and flow requirement for lowest weighted perimeter inflection point. And the low flow threshold was established based on the fish passage flow requirement, because the fish passage requires more flow than the weighted perimeter standard. So 15 cubic feet per second for Horse Creek and 27 cubic feet per second for Charlie Creek are the low flow thresholds. Next slide. And for block 2 minimum flows, 2 criteria were considered. The first one is the water use habitat for fish and macroinvertebrates. And the second one is the inundation of woody habitats, including exposed roofs and snags located along the creek banks within the channel. So the graph here shows the flow reductions required to maintain at least 85% of the water use habitat for some sensitive fish species. And the table shows the flow required to maintain 85% of woody habitat inundation for 1 day, 7 days, and 30 days in a row. And the minimum flows for block was established using the most restrictive one, which is 12% flow reduction in Horse Creek and 40% flow reduction in Charlie Creek. And these flow reductions I expect to protect the woody habitat inundation which allows to the minimum 22% to maintain that 85% inundation of the habitats. Okay, next slide. Okay, next is to protect the high flow regime based on the floodplain habitat inundations. And as you can see here, the block 3 is a wide range of flow. For Horse Creek, it ranges from 72 cubic feet per second all over to 10,000. And the same for Charlie Creek, from 120 cubic feet per second to over 10,000 cubic feet per second. So we divided the block into two based on the sensitivity of the floodplain inundation to flow reduction, as you can see from the graph. And on average, the flow reductions for block 3A came to 14% to maintain at least 85% of the floodplain inundation. And for Charlie Creek, block 3A came to 12%. And for the highest flow regime, block 3B, for Horse Creek, the average withdrawal is 11%, and for Charlie Creek, 9%, to maintain again the 85% of the floodplain inundation. Next slide. Okay, this slide shows the water quality assessment, just to make sure that the the allowable withdrawals under the recommended minimum flows should protect the water quality into the two systems. So to do this, we analyze the water quality relationships with flow using regressions, time series analysis as well. And the table on the left shows the correlation analysis for Horse Creek. And as you can see here, some of the water quality parameters are positively correlated to flow, some negatively correlated, and some have strong correlation, and some have weak or no correlations. And for some selected water quality parameters using DEP numeric values for surface water classification and the observed water quality and flow data, we analyze or calculate the exceedance probability both using the baseline flow condition and the minimum flow conditions. And to do this, we apply the generalized linear mixed models. And as you can see here, some changes have been observed, highlighted in yellow. But the changes between, or the difference between baseline and the minimum flow condition is not that significant, as shown in the last column. The highest change we saw was for the dissolved oxygen in Charlie Creek, where the number of events exceeding 50% probability was 7, and it was reduced to 3 under the minimum flow conditions. And keep in mind that this is only for a comparison between the MFL and the baseline, just by counting the number of 50% exceeding probability. But DEP uses the annual geometric mean to assess the numeric values for each water quality parameter. Next slide. And in addition, we also assessed if the allowable withdrawals under the recommended minimum flows would change the sediment transport and the transfer of the detrital materials. And for sediment transport, we apply the England-Hansen method. This is an empirical method which uses critical velocity and shear stress to estimate sediment discharge. And this is highly recommended for Florida rivers with low slope and sandy soils. And we run this method using both the baseline and the minimum flow conditions. And the relative change was only 12%, which is less than the 15% change district standard. And for the transfer of the treated material, we calculate the change in number of 1-day and 7-day events above the block 2 and block 3 boundary. At the boundary of block 2 and block 3, we expect the channel to have connections with flat planes and start moving or transferring the treated materials. And again, we run this for both the baseline and minimum flow conditions. And the relative change was really small, only 2%. So the recommended minimum flows would really protect the sediment loads or sediment transport and the transfer of treated materials. Next slide. Yeah, so in summary, this is the recommended minimum flows for Horse Creek and Charlie Creek. For block 1, the minimum flow is 100%, meaning no withdrawal is allowed. And this was based on the fish passage flow requirement. And for block 2, for Horse Creek, the minimum flow is 88%, and for Charlie Creek, 86%, based on the fish habitat within the channel. And for block 3A, the minimum flow for Horse Creek is 86%, and for Charlie Creek, 88%, based on floodplain inundation area. And for block 3B, the minimum flow for Horse Creek is 89%, and for Charlie Creek, 91%. And again, based on the floodplain inundation. Okay, and the recommended minimum flows for both systems are currently met, and they are also expected to be met in the next 20 years. But we will evaluate or we will assess the status of the MFL every year. And the recommended minimum flows for both systems are protective of the 10 environmental values listed in the water resource implementation rule that I showed you earlier. Okay, last slide. Okay, this is the plan schedule. Currently, the minimum flows report for both systems are under review by 3 independent scientists. And in October and November, we are planning to present it to district advisory committee and to the public. And by end of November, we will take it to our governing board for approval. And rulemaking is expected to happen in early 2024. Thank you.
Thank you, Yonas. Does anyone have any questions?
Yonas, this is Jennifer with the CHNEP. You have mentioned that part of the initial review by the peer review team had been a recommendation to divide block 3 into 3 sub-blocks. And then I noticed on the last slide there that you had a 3A and a 3B. So you divided it into 2. I just wondered if you could explain a little bit further as to why you decided to divide it into 2 versus 3, and anything further that you could share with us about how you're addressing that peer review comment.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, so can you please go back to the floodplain hydrograph? One more, please. Maybe actually. Yeah. Yes, right. So as I have said earlier, this is really wide range. So the reason why we decided to do 2 blocks is because when the flow is above the 90 percentile, it's highly associated with big storm events and hurricanes. Even it's not practical to withdraw when those events happen. And so we thought that if we divide the blocks into two, I think it's still protective. But currently, these reports are under review, so we're not done yet with the review. So we just got last Monday, one of the peer reviewers actually suggestion if we can divide that into 3 blocks. So yeah, this result was conducted earlier, but still we might change this and divide it into 3 blocks to provide more protection to the infrequent high flows above 90 percentiles. So we are working on it.
Hey, Jennifer, this is Doug Leeper, the MFL's Minimum Flow Levels Program Lead. I wanted to mention that we're in the middle of the peer review, actually in the first phase. The peer review panel is looking at the information that Yonas has shown today, and they're going to provide their initial comments to the district here next week or so. District will then consider all the reviewers' comments and respond to them, and then the panel will be reconvened again to evaluate the district's responses to their initial comments. So it's a multi-phase review process that we're in the middle of. And secondly, I'll mention that we've historically used 2 flow sub-blocks, if you will, for out-of-bank flows for freshwater river segments. And it's been pretty successfully implemented here at the district. And in fact, it's been through nearly 20 independent peer reviews. So there's a strong precedent, both from a technical basis as well as it being examined by independent reviewers. But every review panel comes up with different ideas and suggestions, and that's part of our adaptive management approach to make our work better. So we're kind of in the middle of that process right now. I just wanted to emphasize that.
Do you mind if I ask you a follow-up question or two?
Sure, me or Yonas?
Sure.
Yep.
So when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking about that 15% threshold, and it seems that you've stair-stepped it in a way with these 2 sub-blocks to ensure that you aren't exceeding that 15%. So that seems to address that. And I guess I'm curious as to what was the justification that the peer reviewer had for dividing into 3 sub-blocks.
I think because they believe that the block 3B may not be protective for the highest flows above 90 percentile, which may require only up to 7% to maintain that 85% floodplain inundation.
Yeah, and that argument is the basis for that argument currently, as my understanding from the reviewers, is looking at geomorphic features associated with high flood events, and then how they might cascade through the ecology of the system. So it's a novel way of looking at this issue. And of course, we have to balance it with an understanding that, as Yonas indicated, these high flow events in a runoff driven system are really a function of rainfall and extreme storm events rather than withdrawal impacts. So we have to understand the issue and develop a strategy to deal with it and decide whether it's necessary, for regulatory purposes. Because again, remember, minimum flows and levels aren't permits, but they are used for permitting decisions. So they do, and they can affect, withdrawal permits. So that's it in a nutshell. It's those high flow events. Do they matter to the geomorphology of a river channel?
Okay.
Question. I guess a couple questions. For the sediment transport side of things, was that a 12% reduction in sediment transport then?
Yeah, so what we did was using the baseline flow, we calculated the mean annual sediment discharge. Then we did the same for the MFL condition. Then we calculated the relative change. So we see 12% reduction in sediment under the MFL condition.
And that's each year?
Sorry?
each year an annual 12%?
Yeah, so we run the model, that empirical method from 1950 to 2021, and we averaged it on annual. So that was mean annual sediment yield. Yeah.
And would that compound over time?
Over time. No, we just averaged it over time, over the entire period of record. We averaged it and calculated the relative difference.
I guess what I'm saying is, if you're having that reduction year after year after year, wouldn't that eventually compound and lower your sediment transport capacity?
No, this 12% is not year after year, it's over the entire period of record though.
And then I guess another question related to the fish species that were selected.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're kind of smaller species, like girth-wise. Is there a reason that like snook was not used?
Yeah, I think our in-stream fish habitat, Gabe Herrick is not here today, but I think that can respond to it. That, can you answer that?
Sure, I can. This is Doug Weeper again. So for the in-stream fish assessment, we couple a hydraulic model that we can then use to predict velocities, water depths, and inundation footprints. In other words, what kind of habitats or substrates are inundated. And then we can alter that with with flow reductions. And then we couple that information with what we know about specific fish requirements for water depth, velocity, and habitat preferences. For example, snags and things that provide cover and may serve as a surface for foraging, things like that. We run a standard suite of freshwater fish suitability preferences through the system for environmental flow analysis modeling that I just described. And we target a number of species. I don't remember the number off the top of my head. And we subdivide many of those species into different life history stages, from fry to adult, juvenile, and so forth. So we use whatever information we have available for the fish that we expect to find in the river system. We don't have that type of information that I'm aware of for snook. What we've done with snook modeling, and we've done this in more estuarine portions of this watershed itself for the Lower Peace River and Shell Creek. We use a different kind of habitat model, not the system for environmental flow analysis. We just use a habitat suitability modeling approach. And we do the same kind of thing. We use a hydraulic or hydrodynamic model in the case of the estuarine system that is used to predict salinities, stages, things like that. And then couple that with known information on substrate types and their preferences for estuarine species. So we do that kind of work. We didn't include snook in the freshwater river segments of Horse Creek or Charlie Creek. Well, basically, we are working with Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and for the estuarine work, we've typically worked with the FWRI, or whatever they're called now, FMRI branch of the FWC, to identify appropriate species life history stage targets for our modeling efforts.
Yeah, so I think at this stage I don't think so we have for snook. I don't think so we have those habitat suitability curve for velocity, substrate, and water depths.
Right, but this is Doug again. One thing I will add for our routine freshwater habitat, stream habitat modeling, in addition to the species life history stage groupings that I've identified, we also look at known preferences of certain groups of invertebrates and run those through the habitat analysis. And then we also have catch-all categories that are associated, that can really be associated with a whole host of species that we don't have detailed information on. And they include those that are associated with deep water habitat and shallow water habitat under both low and high velocities. So they're kind of a catch-all groupings, that kind of stand as a surrogate for all the species that we don't have the specific habitat requirements defined.
Yeah, and these graphs are only showing for some sensitive ones, but we've considered a lot of fish species and macroinvertebrates, as Doug said.
Could I ask a follow-up question? Dave Seeley, with respect to the invertebrates, you mentioned the invertebrates. I'm really curious. You have net spinning caddisflies and total invertebrates as two different categories. So what does that mean? Total invertebrates, is that like a total number, or is that diversity? And I'm wondering what literature you used to come up with those two metrics. And are those literature in the report itself? Are they cited in the report?
Hi, this is Doug Leeper. I dropped out of the call and just dropped in, so I don't know if I heard the tail end of whoever was speaking, posing a question, and I didn't know if it was directed towards me or to Jonas.
Probably you, Doug. This is Dave Seeley. I'm asking about the invertebrates. You mentioned the invertebrates, and I'm very interested in them. Use them as indicators of wetland condition, habitat quality, et cetera, for decades. And I'm interested, what does total invertebrates, what does that metric mean? Is that diversity or just total number? And then I like the fact that you have net spinning caddisflies, because that's the important group. I'm just, literature that you use to come up with those two metrics, and is that literature cited in the report?
And yes, it's cited in the report. And what the metric is, it's not abundance, it's habitat availability. So we take that baseline flow record and with known preference information for substrate type, velocity, and water depth, identify the extent of habitat in the study reach for whatever species, whatever species or pseudotaxa we're looking at. Then we do the same thing for flow reduction scenarios to look for change in that available habitat. So it's really a habitat metrics associated with habitat preferences for individual groups or life history stages of organisms. And yes, the information should be cited in that document in our reports, and the information is described as well in the reports. And we've been using these freshwater habitat assessment tools for about 20 years now in our district, the Southwest Florida Water Management District. Other water management districts around the state are picking them up and have applied them for some of their river systems. And we've been working with sort of Fish and Wildlife Conservation staff to develop kind of a standard, what they used to call a blue book. And it's basically the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service used to have a blue book that had these preferences identified for groups of species based on field studies, expert decisions, or best management, or expert, I won't say testimony, expert decisions, but mostly they're based on field studies. And so they can vary from direct site-specific knowledge of preferences of individual organisms in a river segment to generalized habitat preferences, based on information known in Florida or elsewhere. So they vary depending upon, each individual set of preferences.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, David. Yep, Jennifer.
Doug, thank you both, you and Jonas and your team, for preparing this excellent presentation. It seems that there's a lot of interest with TAC members. If a TAC member were, I know you explained the advisory committees and the other public presentations of this, but if a member of the TAC were interested in providing comment, how would you recommend them doing so at this point?
Well, there's You want me to answer that, Jonas, or do you want
Go ahead, Doug. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, sure. So the advisory committees are publicly advertised meetings. The peer review that's ongoing for the Horse and Charlie minimum flows is all publicly noticed. The panel conducts their work in the sunshine. The district facilitates it. So we set up meetings that are noticed for the panel that anyone can come participate in and listen in on. They're run virtually with Microsoft Teams. And then there's a public comment period for each of those at each of those meetings. In addition, because the panels have to work in the sunshine, in accordance with Florida Government and Sunshine Law, the district has set up a web forum for each peer review, and the peer reviewers are able to then communicate and comment and do their review work outside of the regularly scheduled meetings. But yet the web forum is advertised as a public meeting as well, so the public can log in. The public can view all the comments and the back and forth messaging on the web forum, and can also, once they log in, create an account on the forum, can provide comment on the forum itself. In addition, when we take a minimum flow rule eventually to the governing board, district governing board for approval, those are all public meetings. And we will be hosting and publicly noticing a public meeting for all stakeholders to be invited to, and the comment can be provided there. In addition, you can always contact Yonas or his co-project lead, Dr. Christina Deek, or me, Doug Leeper, at the Water Management District by phone or email.
Doug, are those notices on the district website?
Yes. Well, the public meeting notices are they're on the district website, and they're also published in the Florida Administrative Code. And then the web forum, the district has a minimum flow and levels page where we post all of these reports. There's a report for Charlie Creek, there's a report for Horse Creek, and on our minimum flow and levels page is a link to the web forum itself, which is basically just like a message board if you've ever used a forum like Reddit or something like that.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll send you the district web forum link and including our contact information as well. Sorry, I apologize. I should have included it here.
Thank you, Yonas.